Zoetic Press presents Alphanumeric, a fiction and poetry podcast showcasing pieces from NonBinary Review. Today, A Romantic Evening with a Cthulhu Figurine by Kaela McNeil. Afterwards, please stick around for an interview with Séon the Poet from the poetry podcast Poetry Talks, interviewed by Zoetic Press poetry editor Carmen Bearfield. And now, A Romantic Evening with a Cthulhu Figurine. Under the whole wide expanse of an empty refrigerator, I sat next to the open door discussing sprayable butter with Cthulhu, his small 1 porcelain-inch body resting on the top shelf. As I leaned in to receive an envelope full of kisses and pestilence, the air turned green and full of shade, and I did not know which side of the nozzle pointed away from me. The one where I hold my hand out open and awaiting a gift of leftover and moldy grilled beetle and cheese sandwich? Or the other, star and arugula salad? Neither existed inside the bourbon flint of my teeth, so porous and fermented like a fire breather's. But there were candles, scented like beached fish, to make him feel at home, and a tablecloth made of human hair woven in the loom between my breasts. Somehow, he decided, he would wrap his wings around me like plastic wrap over an unfinished plate. This has been A Romantic Evening with a Cthulhu Figurine by Kaela McNeil, read for you by Lisa Quintana. Our music was Caves of Dawn by Guillermo Bernardes, provided by Pixabay.com. Alphanumeric is mixed and mastered by Lisa Quintana. You can get NonBinary Review on our website, zoeticpress.com, or on Amazon. If you like the podcast, please drop in and give us a rating or review, and please subscribe. New work drops on Wednesdays. NonBinary Review, because humans are hardwired to tell stories. And now, Zoetic Press poetry editor Carmen Bearfield interviews Séon the Poet.
Welcome to Alphanumeric, Non-Binary Reviews, podcast of poetry and prose. I'm your host, Carmen Bearfield, and today we welcome Séon the Poet for this special episode. Séon the Poet is the author of the poetry collection Psychedelic Mixtape and hosts not one, but 2 podcasts centered around poetry, Haiku Vibes and Poetry Talks. Both explore the world of contemporary poetry in all its wonder, complexity, and diversity. Welcome, Séon the Poet. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for letting me be on your wonderful podcast.
And I do hope it's a bit warmer in Brooklyn than it is in the Boston area. I hope it is.
Oh, no, it's absolutely not in Brooklyn than it is in the Boston area. It's actually quite cold here.
No, I'm so sorry. For you, you're Séon the Poet, and I'd love to hear about your journey of starting to write and why you kept going.
Okay, well, let's see. I started to write for the same reason why a lot of young men write poetry, which is obviously to get girls. I mean, that was, I'm not even going to say like there was some kind of lofty reason why that I needed to tell my story in a particular way. No, I was trying to write love poems and erotic poems because I know that those were things that women liked. You know, I was in the market. So so I started that back like in high school, and I sucked. I was pretty bad at it. But fortunately, you know, when I moved on to college, I continued doing so. I continued writing in that style. I started enjoying it more, and I started getting luckier. So it kind of gave me the incentive to
hone your craft a little bit more.
To hone my craft, but I've always loved storytelling and so on. So I kept going. Then I started joining poetry clubs, you know, while I was at John Jay. And speaking to other people that wrote poetry, but I never thought of it as a serious thing. And then I just kept going for it. I did not major in writing, in creative writing, at least not in college. And, you know, because I followed my parents, you know, you can't get any real work being a writer, you know, so I listened to them and, you know, I did not pursue it. But when it came around time for my master's after I took a break, I had let me reverse it a little bit. So in the late part of my college career, I had a mentor that was with me through a lot of difficult times. I lost my grandmother and my aunt. Then he had passed away of cancer in 2008. So I wrote a poem in honor of his memory.
Oh.
And I performed it. They had a memorial service, and everyone saw me and him together all the time. It was like I was his son. So I said, okay, well, you get to read this for Professor McGee, and so I read it. Then I had the person who does the professor who does the advanced poetry classes. She said, I'd like for you to join my class. And I said,
that's wonderful.
And I said, well, professor, next semester is my semester, is my last semester, and I did not take the prerequisite. She says, well, there's advantage to being me. So I took the advanced poetry course.
That's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah, I took the advanced poetry. And then after taking the advanced poetry course, she says, if I were you, I would get a master's in fine arts and writing, and and then maybe even teach poetry and English language. So we need more male teachers teaching this stuff. And so this is what she told me, and I'm like, yeah, okay. I'm tired. School is over for me. Anyway, about 5 years later, school was not over for me.
The way it is sometimes, it comes back.
I pursued a master's in creative writing, master's in fine arts and creative writing, and I did much better in it than I did during my college career. I had a much higher GPA, and I really took the ball and ran with it. And since then, I pushed on, and it's really become my craft. And I said, you know what? I needed to earn the name Séon the Poet when I felt I had enough skill. So that's why I just added the poet part.
I love that. I love that so much. I think that's an experience a lot of, some writers from the get-go, they go to school and they're like, I'm going to do it. Whatever my parents say, I am here for writing. And then other people, I've heard a few stories of people going and getting a degree in biology. And then they're like, you know what? I'm actually more passionate about writing. That's it. I'm going to pursue that.
So, on my show, I actually interviewed a guy who was working in the hard sciences and had a degree in biology. I think he's an epidemiologist. His not an epidemiologist, I'm sorry, entomologist. He studies bugs. So
that would be some interesting poetry. Not gonna lie, that'll be pretty interesting with that perspective.
Poetry was in fact interesting from the perspective of an entomologist. I learned a lot of things. I learned a lot of things about dragonflies in that things, and I wouldn't say I didn't care to know about it. It wasn't even on my radar to think about how are dragonflies born, but it worked out.
I'm going to go look back on your podcast and take a look and go find that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so speaking of that, I'd love to kind of go back a little bit into your podcasting journey, because I know that you started Haiku Vibes before you began Poetry Talks. And I'd love to hear about what led you to creating Haiku Vibes, because I love that format of something short and sweet that's meditative, especially in those moments that you need that. And you can also be like, I listened to some poetry today. Good for me. I did it.
So I used to write a lot of haikus because I wanted to do, that sort of haiku of the day kind of thing that they were having on Instagram and whatnot. But I said, I actually want to publish some of this stuff. So I'm like, I can't give all the goods away. I got to make them sweat a little bit. So I was sharing a lot of those pieces, but I said, some people liked it, they didn't. I said, what if I, read it? What if I do an audiobook? I said, no, couldn't think about that. And the pandemic hit. So I was working in corporate America at the time. And, they said, oh yeah, by the way, we are laying off your department because, we can't guarantee the next contract. So I said, okay. It wasn't really that bad because the thing is we had some leftover money to get, I went I did unemployment and went right into employment afterwards. So it really wasn't the worst thing in the world. But also before the pandemic hit, there were a few months where I was working that job before the contract ended. I spent a lot of time at home. I was able to get my work done really fast because I wasn't, I didn't have to go from this office to that office and talk to this person and that person,
Yeah.
so I finished my work much faster than would be expected normally and had a lot of time on my hands. I had gotten COVID the first time, and it was really bad that first time. And so what I did was I said, well, I want to meditate. And my wife was doing more like yoga and things like that. I said, I can use these haikus. I can repurpose this concept. Let me start making a podcast and see if somebody will listen to it. And all I wanted to have is just like one person listen to the podcast.
Yes.
Right? If one person listens to the podcast, I said, then I'll keep going. I'll make a second episode if I can get one person. I told my wife that if I can get one person that's not me or you.
I love that goal. I really do.
Right. So I think I got something like 3 downloads on my first episode.
Hey, that's 3.
It's 3, and you're talking about no money to like do any ads or none of that crap. And so I went on to say, okay, well, we'll do a second episode. And the first few episodes, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I just like read out the haiku. The pacing was like really crappy. It was more like 30 seconds and less of a minute. So you heard the haiku, and then you just heard a beat for like 45 seconds. It was really like new stuff. I said, let me space out the haiku lines, add some deep breathing to it, and then that really started working on. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're like strangers not only here in the United States or in Brooklyn. There's strangers in France listening to it. There's strangers in the UK and Australia. So I was really into it. So a few months down the road, I said, I want to do longer form content. I want to interview people and so on, talk about poetry, read some longer pieces if possible. I did that. And then literally I started seeing my audience taking a hit because I was putting longer form content on the haiku vibe. So it detracted away from the original thing. So I said, well, let's start a new podcast. And this is 2021 rolls around. So I started Poetry Talks. By then I had already made some great connections in the poetry community of up and coming poets and whatever else. And I also was on Clubhouse by that time. So I met a lot of poets. And I said, hey, you want to come on my show? And they said, yeah, I want to come on your show. And what we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about poetry, of course. And you're going to get to read a piece and you're going to get to promote your stuff. And they're like, okay, sign me up.
That's awesome.
That's how I started getting guests. And I said, okay, let's do it one episode at a time. Let's just keep going forward. Then we developed a plan and we developed a system and all that businessy stuff started going on. Yeah. And then we wound up having a more polished and professional sounding and looking product.
I listened to one of the episodes where you were, and I apologize, I don't remember the name of the poet, but she is from the UK and just really brilliant. I really loved the piece that she. Oh,
you're talking about Aziza.
I believe so. Yes.
From she is awesome. She's from the UK. And a quick story on how I met her.
Yeah.
And her piece was about language, I believe, right?
Yes. And she was talking about, I believe it was like having a lisp. It wouldn't translate the way that she intended it to. And she wrote this, the poem is beautiful. And I feel bad that I don't have it written down because I should. But either way, tell that story. Go ahead.
Absolutely awesome. So her poem, her thing is called Fine Words Weave. That's what I called the episode. Mm-hmm. And lovely, lovely woman. So I met her. There was a show on Clubhouse called Poetry and Conversation. And that was like, this is my really early days of Clubhouse. I was on there, and she was one of the very first people I met on there. I recognized her voice and her cadence and so on. And then I was like, this woman's amazing. And then I started finding her in more rooms. Like I went to an improv poetry room, then I would see her in that room. And especially during the daytime, because the UK is 5 hours ahead of New York, she would be on these different rooms. We wound up, getting more in contact with one another. And I just said, hey, we want to be on my show. And she's like, yeah, I'll be on your show. I will be on your show. And she ended up on the show. and I was so happy. It's definitely one of the higher performing episodes. And without getting too technical with that stuff, it was definitely a well done episode, and I really loved my talk and my conversation with her. It kind of felt more like an episode of that poetry and conversation show on Clubhouse with a lot less people.
Yeah, I need to check out Clubhouse.
Yeah.
That's a wheelhouse I need to jump into.
It's a veritable gold mine of poets.
Yeah. And so I'm going to kind of jump into, I'll backtrack a little bit into my questions. But since we're on Clubhouse, I'd love to hear about your experience going into that space. And I would imagine that like Twitter Spaces is going to be something a little bit similar. But I'd love to hear if you have any advice for poets who, with the pandemic and everything going on, they just haven't had a chance to go to open mics the way they used to. They can't engage with their community the way that they used to. And kind of getting over that nervousness of going online and talking to people and meeting them and sharing sometimes very personal work, right? And do you have any advice for them if they're jumping into it?
I absolutely do. So one of the things that it was for me is, well, I'm an introvert. I was petrified of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go to open mics and have a bunch of people looking at me and I'm looking so close to the paper and oh my gosh. No. So what I would tell them is keep an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
You can do this in pajama pants at home with a cup of coffee or a seltzer or something like that and relax. You can breathe how you want to breathe. You can look at it on your monitor. And I would say, you can have a chance, especially on Clubhouse, like on Thursdays and Friday nights, you can have a chance of going to 3 or 4 open mics based in various parts of the country in one night.
Which is amazing.
Yeah. And so that will condense your level of exposure. And the good thing about that is while you may feed off of the crowd reaction, like the live crowd reaction, you can also still feed off of a lot of reaction from those who are on stage with you. And I think that helps, especially if you come from a background where you're not accustomed to performing poetry. So like I wasn't accustomed to performing poetry, and I wrote most of my poetry for the page, not the stage. But my presence and my cadence and my ability to deliver pieces has improved greatly due to apps like Clubhouse.
Yeah, I'm that type of poet where a lot of the times I'm writing for the page, right? And so with everything that's been going on with the pandemic, it's been harder to just kind of engage with the community. So I really appreciate all the work that you're doing, not only connect online in Clubhouse spaces, but then also bringing people to your podcast and giving them that exposure that they might not have gotten during this time. Because it's so stressful, everything that's going on.
Yeah, so like for the poetry spaces, what I, especially when I meet other poets and talk to other people on the podcast, like when I bring them to the couch, as it were, or to the table, as it were, in my platform, it kind of gives them ability to talk a little bit more expansively about themselves and about their poetry and their craft and life, whereas if you are on a Clubhouse open mic, depending on how the moderator structures the open mic, you might only just have enough time to deliver your piece and maybe say a little bit of 30 seconds or so about yourself or whatever else. And I feel it's enough to get people's appetite whet, but it's not enough to really give people a full idea of the piece. And unless you are featuring, you may not have the opportunity to read more than one piece.
And that's a really important to keep in mind, because I think in in-person experience, if you hang out after, people will come up to you and like chat with you a little bit. And I can imagine with Clubhouse, it's a little bit different. You like what you did, you had ended up seeing the same people in different rooms and reaching out to them, but there's that lost opportunity for that organic just conversation and getting to know more about the poet and the poem.
Exactly. And I think like, now that things like, of course, like with the COVID being the way that it is, things open and they close, things are going to eventually open back up. And I think sooner rather than later. And once that happens, you're going to have your live open mics again. The
Mm-hmm.
way how I see it, it's gonna really hybrid. I can see a situation where there's an open mic, but there's also a Clubhouse or a Twitter Spaces room
Mm-hmm.
going in the background of the open mic. I'm giving some open mic hosts and presenters. I'm giving them some nuggets.
You really are.
You know, they can have like something running in the background. And I feel like what was a missed opportunity with Clubhouse is Clubhouse didn't do as much to let itself run on the web or let itself run as a web app or on computers. Whereas you may have someone that are like, hey, listen, I'm a poet, but I don't like how I sound through earpods. I don't like how I sound through the phone's microphone. And there are too many dongles and too much crap that you have to buy in order to have a proper microphone on your phone. So if you're able to do it on the computer, that may make people who are a little bit more seasoned feel that they can deliver their content in a way that ties loyally to their personal brand.
No, definitely. For those seasoned people who are pure like spoken word poets, they are performers. They are brilliant at like bringing that energy and that emotion. And if the phone can't pick that up, I can understand why maybe some of them are like, I'll skip this. I'll skip this open mic, and that loses an opportunity for everybody to like enjoy their work.
Yeah, like my very first guest,
Mhm.
she was an open mic host, and she actually has an open mic that she's hosting tomorrow, and so her Twitter handle is My Crumbled Thoughts, and she was my very first guest. And when I had when I had J Rose on, you know, I asked her, I said, "Can you be my first guest on this new show? Because I know you are a performance poet. I would like for you to perform a piece on this show. And moreover, I think you have delivered a lot of great opportunities for others and interviewed a lot of others. So I want to interview you." And she said, "Sure, why not?" She's a great person. So she went ahead and did that. And I said, "I promise I'm gonna make your voice sound nice." And so we had a great first episode. I learned more or less about how to, and I started getting more ideas about how to incorporate that live performancing and then bring it into a pandemic friendly way. We could then build it back out once this pandemic is over, whether it's socially or medically over.
Yep. And I really appreciate that forethought, right? Like thinking about how are we gonna adjust to this new normal? And so I also had a question for you about your collection. So I'd love to hear about that journey, because you had published psychedelic mixtapes, and I believe it was April 2020.
Yes.
Right.
So psychedelic mixtape. The interesting thing is, so like when the initial rollout of that book came out on April 20th of 2020, that was a very hard day for me because my mother had caught COVID really bad.
Oh,
And,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, she's okay now. Thank you very much. She had caught COVID really bad, and so she was. This is when they set up the Javits Center and so on. It was a really emergency situation, and we almost lost her that day. And I had like Instagram lives and crap scheduled. And so by the evening, we learned that, okay, she was going to be fine, or she was at least not going to die. So I continued, and okay, well, you know, the show must go on. It's not like I could have gone there to see her anyways.
Yeah.
And so,
which is devastating.
Yeah, very much so. So, you know, that launch was a little bit bittersweet. You know, and so but the creation of the book was through 2019. It was definitely pre-pandemic. And a lot of the work in there was really based on it took a lot of real world things and pointed the finger on a lot of real world things and touched on a lot of issues, but in a way that like psychedelic rock from the 1960s and early 70s did. You know, that it used a lot of colorful imagery, a lot of imagery that, like, let's say if you get in touch with nature or cannabis and what have you, you know that these visuals would pop even more. So I said, I want to give someone a sense as if they are on cannabis, on weed, without actually, you know, doing that, because it seems people
partaking. They get the energy from the poem.
yeah, it's what's it's you know it's people's choice what they put into their body. If they're like, I don't want to, that's not my jam, that's fine. But the poem will really flip reality sort of on its head, but in the meantime still talk about serious issues in a way that is, catchy and whimsical.
Yes.
And, like, if I were to like describe a song and say what's an appropriate song to think about for psychedelic mixtape to compare it to, I would say "Strawberry Fields Forever" by the Beatles.
I love that.
I would say that's like that level of imagery. Like like living is easy with eyes closed. Those kind of lyrics. Let me talk about things like police brutality. Talk about things like race relations. Let me talk about things like the political situation, the nature of social media. But I'm going to talk about it and give you and put you on a trip as if we are in Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
While Strawberry Fields plays in the background. And so it really did have that sort of view, and that's how I created it. That's how I created that particular piece and that particular body of work. And it really came together. And one of the most important things about it, and I had talked about it even on my show, this idea of, I respect people who say that their creative process is an organic one, that they write the poetry when the poetry comes.
Yep.
But like, I challenge that when I say I created Psychedelic Mixtape by setting a schedule for myself, that I made sure that I wrote X amount of words a day, at least, or that I made sure that I sat down at the desk and wrote. Because the way how I saw it is, yeah, the muse comes and we all work based on the muse. But the thing about it is, working for publishers and dealing with deadlines and so on, is you have to get it out by a certain time.
Yeah.
And so your muse may not be that reliable. Your pen might not be ready to write at a certain time. But you have to make your muse reliable, develop that muscle memory.
Yeah.
And that's what I started doing, was developing that muscle memory.
Yes.
And I felt the poetry started just coming more naturally, that I could say, okay, let me just slap on my headphones, sit in front of the computer, and then all of a sudden I might think about 2, 3, 4 words, a short line, and then a poem comes from there.
Yes.
So I'm a huge respecter of setting that up. And I got that idea from when I read On Writing a Memoir of the Craft by Stephen King. Have you ever read it?
I have not. I'm gonna add it to my list. There we go.
It's an awesome thing. I don't know if you're a Stephen King fan. You're up there in New England, so you're more in his neck of the woods.
Yes. Just a short drive, kind of.
Yeah.
Go visit.
The old Victorian house where America's boogeyman lives.
Yeah.
So, and just a real quick caveat, I actually had an opportunity to meet him.
Oh, really?
I lived in Tulsa. And and I was so nervous and stuff about it. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be able to do that. I saw the tickets were available. Pulled out my wallet. My card was not in my wallet. Available for end of watch, the book signing, right?
Oh
so
my
I said,
gosh.
okay, let me go grab my wallet. It's probably my coat. I went either to grabbing the coat. Damned if 2 minutes later, Kane's Ballroom was not, the tickets weren't already sold. I said, oh my God, I could have gotten an autograph.
I would have begged somebody. I'm going to turn around and be like, look, I will cash app you right now. Please help me out.
Yeah. I mean, but the thing is, I didn't really know enough people that I was going to go do that. I was saying,
yeah.
Should I just go and look real sus hanging outside of Kane's? Hey, is Stephen King there?
Well, maybe you can take a drive up to Maine at some point. I hear he's very friendly, and he's like walks around town like super, and just be like, hello, Just wave. Just get that little.
so it's also like, maybe at the time it was for the better, don't meet your heroes and stuff like that. But I really do want to meet him. I should actually go up there. So what he said on writing a memoir of the craft, he said, when you're a writer,
yeah,
it's your job, it's your craft, right? So there's no such thing as like a plumber doesn't get plumber's block. The plumber's like, hey, I'm not feeling it today, can't fix these pipes. He said, it's another job like masonry, bricklaying, plumbing, whatever the case is. When you have deadlines, they're not trying to hear that you didn't feel inspired. And, and that's the thing, you just set up some time to write, and you write it, because even a crappy poem, even if you write absolute trash, and
it's words on the page,
and anyone who says that they've written a banger every time is a damn liar. I said that on your podcast, right?
Truth.
I know I've written some stinkers, and I've even known that, like, I've also had, a couple of poems or whatever the case is that's in a collection. I'm like, you know what? Maybe that might not have resonated with me all the way at that time, but it will resonate more with someone else.
Yes.
I mean, if Stephen King can admit, hey, I've written some novels that I was not as connected to, or I've, come up with some things that were not necessarily the best or as commercially successful as I thought it was going to be. I mean, hell, I'm just a poet from Brooklyn, New York, with like way less experience or way less time in the writing game and way less money. But the thing is, if he can admit it, I can admit it too. So not everything is going to be a banger, and you just have to get words on that page as you put it.
Yes. I've heard the phrase of writing really begins with editing, or that process of just like embracing, hey, this one's not working out. How do I fix that? How do I work on that? Do you have like a process, or like I have my own like writing and editing quote unquote like ritual of I light a candle, I make tea, I sit down, I open everything up, and I go, all right, I'm ready to edit. Rip these words apart.
So I get into two different mind frames. Like if I'm writing a short story, right? Believe it or not, like I'll throw on these headphones and like put on something like Metallica or a Slipknot or some kind of speed metal.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm just like, let's listen to this. It's like head banging and and stuff like that. And I'm just like listening to this stuff and I'm banging it out. And this started in grad school. Like in grad school, when I had to write long papers, I would like just turn on some metal, some head banging music, some Marilyn Manson, some stuff like that. I would just literally let my thoughts flow as quickly as my fingers can put them down. Now, the poetic process is slightly more deliberative.
Yes.
So I might throw on some lo-fi music. I might get in touch with nature, and and just start writing. I do have a poetry prompts, a writing prompts book that I would use from time to time. I have a couple of them because it's a craft. I have some expository books on writing that I've read before, and I have a rhyme book and a rhyming app. So a lot of times what I would do is I would come up with things on my own.
Yeah.
Write it on my own first, right? What I have in my mind. Now I might find a better word or better rhyme later, but I want to get it down on the page. So all I would just do is, even if I look at the poetry prompts book, sometimes it gets open, sometimes it doesn't. Right? It just depends on where my head is at.
Yes.
If I really can't think of something to start off a poem, I'm like, well, I'm not leaving here without a poem. So, muse be damned. I'm going to open up this writing promise book, see something, write a poem about a cat, or write a poem about whatever, what you had for breakfast. I'll start there. And then all of a sudden it comes out to being a poem that is an indictment on the political situation. And how did it get there? Shit.
It got there. That's it.
Right? That's where the muse comes in.
Yes. So going into the process, I know that you're a photographer as well as a poet. And with Alphanumeric, which is connected to our magazine NonBinary Review, we also take in a lot of visual art submissions for the magazine. And so I'd love to hear, as a photographer, does your poetry inform your photos and vice versa? Do they have like that synergy?
Oh, absolutely. Like, so I consider poetry and photography to be so closely related. And that's because you're taking the world and you are changing the world, right? I know it might sound kind of like aloof or campy or somehow, but but follow me on this.
I'm with you. Go ahead.
So like when you take a picture, right? Even if you do nothing, even if you take the crappiest picture in the world, you're taking something from a 3D space and making it two-dimensional. So you've already changed the world there. Any sort of composition or additions or treatments that you add to that photo, that's just icing on the cake, right? Poetry does the same thing, right? You don't write, you can write a poem that is very literal and is very sentence sounding, like I walked down the street. But if you were to say, as my spirit traveled down Montague Avenue, I felt a sense of foreboding. Yeah. Right? That is a more bookish way of saying the same thing. And that's what photography does to the real world. And that's what poetry does to the real world. It takes something and it turns it around. Like if I were to take this can of seltzer that I'm holding, I just turn it sideways. It can look more interesting, but it's still a can of seltzer. And so I feel like they both kind of inform each other. Like I would take a picture, and sometimes I might take a picture of like a really crappy scene. Like I was outside of a pizza shop here in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood that was getting increasingly run down, again for a second time, I suppose. And I took the picture at night, and I said, you know what? This is a black and white photograph. And as I looked into it more detailed, I started seeing like things that I didn't notice when I was actually walking down that street. And it inspired me to write more, but the pizza from that place was so delicious. And so it was like almost like a diamond in the rough. And that helped to inspire poetry. Yes. So I let them ping pong off of one another all the time.
I love that. For myself, it's like, oh, it's a siloed thing. Like this project is this project. But no, they all talk to each other. They all inform each other.
They all do.
Yeah.
Like, so I wrote a new collection that's in the pandemic. That was in the pandemic. And, I'm like ping-ponging between whether to publish it independently or to have a major publisher. So I've been sending it out, like submitting it out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this cake has been baked for so long, and I just needed to come out when the message is still so raw and so fresh in people's mind of the pandemic. But you know what? It's always going to be fresh. It's always going to feel relevant. And so while that cake is baked, you guys can look out for something like that in 2022. Hopefully, if I have one of the bigger guys do it, or who knows, I may work with an independent publisher.
Yeah.
In terms of getting that collection going, but that manuscript is done, and writing Psychedelic Mixtape has informed so much of it. Looking at pictures, especially pictures from the news and so on, has informed so many of it, that it's the idea of turning a mirror on society. And just like as I talked about photography changing the world, a mirror distorts the image slightly too.
Yeah. And then you can notice all those little things that you might not have seen before, or look a little deeper into those things. And that's one of those reasons why I truly appreciate poetry so much. And I appreciate that you're a fellow poet that follows that guide, like looking at the world, and whether it's extreme or mundane, we just find the poetry in it, and I love that.
Oh, absolutely. Because there is one thing I've said a lot on my Instagram is there's poetry in everything.
Yes.
If you look for it, you can find poetry everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you brought up about, 2022, I can't believe that we're already midway through January. we're going to blink. It's going to be already summer, which I'm looking forward to that. But and congratulations on, having another manuscript already up and going. Like, hey, but for 2022, what are some of your poetry writerly goals and getting that out there? Like, what are you looking forward to?
As I'm sending stuff out, I've also been sending other things out at a very rapid clip. I have the book that was done in 2020, 2021. It was finished in early 2021, and so the editing process has happened, and I'm just shopping that manuscript out. There is another poem that I think the writing deadline on that is somewhere in at the end of March. So then that's going to be a second manuscript finish. And then I'm at the very early parts of a third manuscript. So one of the things I like to do is once I complete a manuscript is I ignore it. I treat it like a stepchild. It doesn't even exist to me.
It is Cinderella. It is doing other things.
Yeah, so it's just baking. And that's the thing that I learned from the honor writing book I mentioned. I do so much to sell that book, and I'm not making a dime from it. But it worked so much from me. And one of the things I learned from it is Stephen King himself. He says, when I write a manuscript, I put it in a drawer and ignore it for about 3 to 6 months. And the reason why is when you come back to reading it again, you read it with a completely fresh set of eyes, and you're no longer as hypercritical of it as before. Whereas if you write a manuscript, before you send this out to an editor, before you shop this out to publishers and whatever else, you're like, okay, well, is this there? Let's cross every I, dot every T. Did I intentionally misspell that word? Am I gonna put any intentional misspellings? These kind of other things is where you go into it. If you sock that away, let it bake, let it marinate, let it season, whatever analogy you want. You come back with it with a fresh set of eyes, and you look at it the way that a reader would. And then you also can have other readers and have people give it a test read on that time. So part of my 2022 goals is to have that second manuscript finished. By the end of 2022, I hope to complete another collection. And these collections are beefy enough. We're not talking about like a 25 poem collection. We're talking about, a full-on LP, as it were. You're talking about that it's about 90 to 100 poems for each book. So we're not talking about,
not a chapbook, it's full. It's a full collection.
We're not talking about a chapbook, and no disrespect to those that do chapbooks or put things out in magazines, because that is a great way of really breaking in with your audience. A lot of times I tend to break up books into parts and just offer it as something a little bit smaller for different audiences. But I just go for the whole shebang.
Yes.
Swinging for the fences. And so that's what I intend to do in 2022. Is to keep swinging for the fences. I also hope that to definitely get the podcast out there in a more visible way, to collaborate with more writers and more podcasters, and improve my network, because at the end of the day, we can't do it without each other.
Yes.
Whatever I can do to enhance other people's network only helps them, and I feel it helps me as well. So that's going to be really there, just more getting out there, whether we are on lockdown or not, just getting the words out there, getting everything out there, and being out there in a more meaningful and positive way.
Yeah. And speaking of expanding your network, where can our Alphanumeric listeners find you?
Okay, well, you can find me on Instagram at Séon the Poet. That's all one word. And I kind of made it really easy. So Instagram, Clubhouse, and Twitter is Séon the Poet, all one word. And I have it on TikTok and Snapchat. So I've kind of homesteaded that just to make sure that you guys can all find me in one place. And then additionally, I have the podcast, the Poetry Talks podcast. Definitely shout out to Alphanumeric for you guys bringing me on. And on the Poetry Talks podcast, you guys can find that wherever you find your podcast. I prefer you guys do it on Apple Podcasts if you can, because on Apple Podcasts, you get ratings and reviews, whereas some of the other podcasting platforms only give you ratings, others only give you reviews, and then most of them don't give you either option. So I have listeners that are like, okay, maybe I might have a listener that might stop listening to the podcast, and I don't know why.
Yeah.
But if you leave a rating, if you leave a review, that might help me. It might help my team to know, okay, what can we tweak with the
Yes.
formatting? What can we do? What can we build on, right, to help the podcast move forward and to also make more deliverable and interesting content.
Yeah. It is always the goal. Always the goal. So thank you so much for talking with me today. It was really wonderful. I learned a lot. And yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So have a good rest of your day.